with your permission, I'm going to go ahead and get it started. All right. Hello, everybody. With pleasure, I'll be moderating this session on Stephanie Kelton's deficit myth. And let me just make a few introductions, and we're going to get things started with Jim. So this panel is sponsored by Association for Institutional Thought, which has been around for a long time. We celebrated our 40th anniversary last year, so it's 41-year-old association. And the association has a long tradition of having book discussion panels. So this panel is going to be the latest installment in that long series of book discussion round panels. Stephanie Kelton, the author of the book Deficit Myth, was nice enough to join us, is nice enough to join us today. So we're really grateful. So we have 4 panelists who'll be commenting on the book, various aspects of the book. And I'd like to just briefly introduce our panelists. Jim Peach, New Mexico State University. Hendrik Van Den Berg, currently teaching at University of Massachusetts Amherst. Zdravka Todorova, Wright State. And Reynold Nesiba, I think I'm going to butcher it, Augustana University. Did I say it right? Okay, all right. And obviously, Stephanie Kelton is, like I said, nice enough to join us. So the way we're going to structure the panel, our first 4th panelist will comment on the book, and Stephanie will be given a chance to respond to the panelists, and then we're going to turn to the public. And so those of you who are attending and watching, you should be able to just post your questions on the chat. And we're trying to make sure, as far as the time allows it, for Stephanie to hear and respond to your comments and questions as well. So, and again, I listened to the book, by the way. I didn't read it. Nowadays, that's what I do. I didn't know, Stephanie, it was you reading it. It was wonderful narration. So very good job. Apart from everything else, that was a very good. I was happy that I actually listened to it, and now discovered that it was your own voice. All right, Jim. Let's get things started with you.
Okay, thank you, and it's quite fun to be here. Yeah, if you have not read Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth, stop what you're doing and go get a copy and read it. This is probably the most influential book so far in the 21st century on macro and money. Within weeks of its publication, this book hit the New York Times bestseller list, and I took that out. It was very shortly after its publication last June 30th. And it's been great fun to see Stephanie appear on CNBC and have even the conservative Joe Kernan admit somewhat cynically, we're all MMTers now. And that's just a lot of fun. That may not have been as impactful as Nixon's statement that we're all Keynesians now, but it was in the same vein. Good fun. Stephanie's been a media star for a long time, not just after the publication of this book. You've probably seen her on MSNBC, on PBS, on C-SPAN, and many other kinds of outlets. So there can't be any doubt about the importance or impact of this book and this story. The book is very well written, very readable. That the kind of mythical, educated layperson should have no trouble reading it. And like Rojhat, I first listened to this as an audio book. And in many cases, publishers of audiobooks ignore the author and have someone else read it. But Stephanie was so good at this. It was so smooth and soothing. What a wonderful thing the audiobook was. Now, the story told in this book is not a new one. In fact, Stephanie Kelton readily admits when she cites Lerner's functional finance and other precursors to contemporary MMT, but good stories need to be told again and again, and told better than they were in earlier versions. And that's what this book does. The story is not new also, and that can be confirmed by statements and actions of the Federal Reserve System. At the start of World War II, the Fed told the story remarkably well when the Board of Governors said it was prepared to use its powers to assure at all times an ample supply of funds for financing the war effort. So this goes back a long, long way. What's new is the name in the last decade or two. Late 1980s, the Fed even abandoned the money supply as a policy target after its own researchers and many others could not find a stable demand for money function using any definition of money. So what good is their quantity theory if M is ill-defined and velocity is not constant? They just gave up on that. In the late 1990s, when budget surpluses threatened to eliminate the federal debt, Alan Greenspan, who had spent half a century ranting about debt and deficits, he practically begged the Clinton administration not to eliminate debt. He said, I've got to have something to buy and sell to conduct open market operations. How else can I control interest rates? Just don't do that. The other thing that he argued at the time was that if you destroy US debt, if you bring it down to zero, you would destroy the only zero risk financial instrument in the world. You'd bring havoc to financial markets. Later, he even said, the United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is no possibility of default. That's pretty much an MMT story. It's also not a new story because you can find it in the textbooks if you have a good sense of humor. Nearly all macro books, there will be a chapter on money, and in that chapter, they will say money is created by banks when they make loans in a multi-bank fractional reserve banking system. And then they'll give you some Keynesian sort of plausible explanation of the demand for money, and then a statement that says the Fed, the central bank, controls the money supply. That's the only way they can manipulate their models. All of this is done in the context of either the quantity theory or some simple little macro model involving a limited quantity of loanable funds. Now, if you destroy that, you've destroyed everything that they might have to say about crowding out and about inflation. And if students read those chapters together, they'd see that these stories are just not compatible, that it won't work. Now, shifting gears a little bit, Professor Kelton argues that the federal government can finance anything it wants to. But she appropriately argues the real constraint on government funding is not finance, it is the capacity of the economy to produce goods and services. And that's a theme you'll find in various places throughout the book. Her main concern seems to be the labor market. And when the economy approaches full employment, or maybe exceeds it, wage increases could generate inflation, and that's certainly true. We've had some episodes that have been referred to as wage inflation. That's a very, very plausible kind of story. You know, why not blame it on workers? We certainly wouldn't want to blame it on the meritorious behavior of the rich. Now, the three things that might mitigate even that problem. First, we live in an international economy, which author recognizes. And while some goods may be non-tradable, the fact that we do live in an international economy means that there'll be downward pressure on inflation, competitive pressures, if you like. And so it might not work. The other thing that even in the standard model, Mundell-Fleming model of international trade, we can only have crowding out that is partial if you have international capital flows, and we've certainly got an international capital flow. The second thing, also recognized in the book, is that technological change should ensure higher productivity per worker, and that should put downward pressure on any inflation or even inflationary expectations. That's apparent in many industries, but especially in the oil industry, which I study a lot. Between 2014 and 2019, the US increased its oil output by more than 50%. And it did so with half the number of active oil rigs and 20% fewer workers. And if you have that sort of thing going on, perhaps in a lot of industries, the inflationary pressures certainly ought to disappear. The third thing is, I don't know what full capacity of the economy really is. I don't. If you had to pick an historical period that where we might have come close to full capacity, it might have been World War II. But various reports from the War Production Board and other sources tell us that the US economy, although it had produced a tremendous amount of war goods, it could have produced a lot more: planes, tanks, trucks, jeeps, uniforms, whatever we might have needed. We didn't produce more because we did not need them. We could have done more. We were not at the capacity of the economy to produce. I don't know when we reach that limit. Now, we have to keep an open mind about all of this. We're in the midst of a great hypothesis test. Since March of last year, almost exactly, March 27 was the date we passed the CARES Act. We've either spent or authorized to be spent in the last year and over the next several months, $5 trillion. That's climbing on a giant scale. And the critics of those programs suggest that it may result in inflation. we're about to find out if $5 trillion is enough to generate a bit of inflation. The hypothesis test like I have not seen since Paul Volcker did the great monetary experiment in the early 80s and demonstrated without doubt monetary policy can slow down an economy. It's an amazing thing, but we ought to keep an open mind about that. Okay, now in the preface to the book, Stephanie suggests MMT is really a paradigm shift. She brings up Copernicus and some other things, and you know, I was always frustrated with Thomas Kuhn about what is or what is not a paradigm shift. This is certainly a bit different, but we don't need to bring up Thomas Kuhn and argue about what is or what is not a paradigm shift. One thing's pretty certain: the mainstream is not going to rush to the divorce courts to separate itself from its twin marriages to the quantity theory and to the loanable funds doctrine. Without the quantity theory, they have very little to say about inflation. And you can see that even now in the statements of Janet Yellen and certainly Paul Krugman and others. They are so wedded to the idea that somehow if you increase the money supply, whatever that might be, that you're going to end up with inflation. They're just not going to abandon that. They're not going to abandon that at all. And I'm almost through here. The other thing is in the book, and its influence, early in the book, Stephanie suggests that her goal, in fact, I'll read you the quote: "The book aims to drive the number of people who believe the deficit is a problem closer to zero." And that's a really admirable, subtle goal. Subtle because she said closer, not close to zero, but closer to zero. She covered herself very well on that. Now, sometimes books, only a very small portion of the public is ever going to read this book, even if it's a bestseller, 1 million copies. There are 330 million people in the US. Sometimes books have a much wider influence than the number of people who have read it. It's certainly true of Kane. I even suspect that a lot of economists have never read the general theory, much less anything else of Kane. So we can be hopeful there. I remain a bit skeptical. I taught intermediate macroeconomics for a long, long time, and I am convinced that most of the public don't understand the difference between fiscal and monetary policy, or between debt and deficit. They just don't understand it. And if they can't understand that, how can they understand a rather subtle and sophisticated argument concerning how to finance the federal government expenditures? So I hope she's absolutely correct. I'm doubtful. Okay. And to kind of end my discussion, I kind of have a wish list. Number one, I wish that Stephanie Kelton and other MMTers would quit referring to MMT as just a lens. It is clearly more than a lens. It has policy implications just to state it, just to state that you can finance government expenditures, large government expenditures beyond any sort of revenue, that's a policy statement. The second thing is, I wish in addition to books like this, that there were some very good short articles in magazines, journals like The Atlantic or The Nation or The American Prospect. We reach an even wider audience. And finally, and this won't be very well received anywhere, I think MMT needs some equations and graphs. And if you don't have the equations and graphs that make it easy for a simple-minded professor to teach this stuff, it won't find its way into the textbooks. And I think that's where it's got to go. It's got to go into the textbooks next. So I would suggest some equations. And I will end by just saying, thank you again for writing a marvelous book. It really is a nice book. And I hope you're right about its influence, not me. And I would remind everybody that the subtitle of the book is also important. The Birth of the People's Economy. That's really important, and I didn't focus on that. Maybe I should have, but thank you.
Thanks, Jim. What we do, I think we wait until all the panelists are done commenting, then Stephanie can weigh in and respond to some of these comments and questions. So we're going to continue with Hank. It's floor is all yours, Hank. Go right ahead.
Okay. Again, Stephanie, thank you for writing this wonderful book. I used the book in my Principles of Macroeconomics. I'm using it this fall in a class of 450 students. So you are being exposed to a good number of beginning students in economics. I think the book works extremely well. Let me explain how I bring this book into the course. I have designed my own Principles of Macro and am writing a textbook to go with it as I am teaching it. Don't ever try to do that because you have a deadline every week and it's almost impossible to meet that, but we're staying a few days ahead of the students. Let me explain where I bring your book in, Stephanie. We're on it right at this moment. The students are reading it and I'm getting very good feedback from it, very enthusiastic. I haven't gotten any complaints back, and in fact, many, many positive comments. So it's going over well. Now I've prepared them for this, hopefully quite well. The way I'm teaching macroeconomics is largely going to be Keynesian based. However, it is also historical, and I'm looking at several alternative schools of thought. And I'm teaching the macro by first introducing the economy, giving the main features, and I actually introduce money at that point. What is it? And we go through a week of discussion on what money really is from a historical perspective. And I use a lot of MMT material there, obviously, but much other material as well. Then we discuss models in general. We haven't talked about macroeconomic policy yet or models, but we're looking at models in general, at which point we contrast static models versus dynamic models versus dialectic models as very different ways of modeling and envisioning an economy. That's what I want to ultimately work the macro models into. Then we do the classical model. And I present kind of a stylized, a depiction of 75 years of writing essentially, talk about Say's law, the invisible hand, the loanable funds market, the Walras all exchange economy, a number of those characteristics of the general classical / neoclassical model. And that then lets us bring in Keynes very nicely. Of course, Keynes starts out by criticizing Say's law. And so now the students have had that, they've seen it. We include in there a very nice discussion on where are all those markets that are supposed to be there. We explain how unrealistic that basic model is, and then we bring in Keynes at that point. We focus on a number of the main elements of Keynes, the aggregate demand function, the components of aggregate demand, the usual Keynesian perspective is given there. And then I move into post-Keynesian economics, and that's where we are at this point, and that's where your book comes in. We're taking 2 weeks to read your book. in place of my textbook. So I get 2 weeks off here of writing chapters. Eventually, I will write a chapter on your book specifically to include in there, and a number of the things that you bring up in the book, but I'm having them read your book at this point. So that's where we are at this point. So they've been well prepared, got a classical view, the Keynesian view, and then the modern money theory view. Then from there, we move next week, we go on to Marx. We are at UMass Amherst, so which is a Marxist department to some degree. So we bring Marx in the circuit of capital and the dialectic, this dynamic, very dynamic, dialectic, chaotic process of conflicts and contradictions, moving a complex, very complex, large, holistic system forward in time. And that's what I try to work modern money theory into. I forgot to mention, actually, that among the first topics, we also introduce institutions, which is rather important for modern money theory, something that most of macroeconomics ignores altogether. So we have a good, solid institutional basis there as well. And then we talk about the main contribution. And what I attribute as the main contribution to modern money theory is taking into consideration institutions within a complex economic system. And what does that mean? And I try to generalize modern money theory and the things that you talk about, that it just doesn't only apply to today's economy. And that's one of the conflicts that's out there. MMT just talks about how that works today, but it's irrelevant to other periods. No, MMT basically says respect the institutions. And how does that define money? How does that determine which thing we use as money? And how does that determine how money operates in the economy? It can be quite different. And I actually use a very little interesting example of hunter-gatherer society that also has money. It's something called tradition, culture, and trust. After all, that is really what money is fundamentally, right? So we look at that historical view, and we talk, in post-Keynesian, we look specifically at today's institutions, and we get to the point of money being largely endogenous, and money operating the way we see it operating now. And from there, I jump into, we talk a little bit about a few other possible systems, the Dutch polder system of policy making, and we talk about ecology, and that's how the course, what the course includes. That's the ecological issue is important. I'm very glad you bring that up, Stephanie, in the book, talking about the capacity of the economy. Yeah, we're facing some constraints in capacity, whatever those are, Jim, and I agree with you, it's hard to determine, but there most definitely are some constraints there, and we face those. And very nicely in your book as well, you bring in the issue of the nice thing about modern money theory and the focus on employment, the focus on expenditures. Fiscal policy means we can direct the movement of the economy. We can change the structure of the economy. So we bring in the whole issue of structure of an economy into the principles course, that's not a given, that it changes and we can direct it. Policy is part of that, of shaping the economy. And again, you provide, again, very, very, very nice examples in all of that. So that's roughly how we've brought your book into the principles of macroeconomics at UMass in Econ 104, as it's called. And I'll be doing this again next fall. And by then, hopefully, we'll have gone through it once and taken the kinks out of it. But it's so far so good. The student reception has been quite good on this. I haven't run into any major issues. I do want to bring up an important point here, and that is being essentially, what should I say, originally familiarized with MMT while being in Kansas City, that University of Missouri at Kansas City, where, it all seemed fairly straightforward. This makes sense. This is good economics. And you kind of think, well, going to UMass as another heterodox department would be very receptive. And I ran into a stone wall, frankly. I don't know, Stephanie, you've probably noticed that. There is a certain animosity against MMT at UMass. And I've spent, the last couple of years trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And it just reminds you again of how provincial we can get in economics. Here we are, heterodox departments allegedly open to all kinds of things. And I do have to say, I mean, I can teach my course any way I want to here. I have total freedom. And they've been very supportive. I haven't run into any issues. On the other hand, I have, some very able faculty. I mean, these are top-notch economists who keep questioning the basic ideas of MMT. And the only suggestion that I have on how to deal with that, and that's how I've tried to do this, and I've worked this into the teaching with your book, is I think there's this impression out there that MMT says you can print as much money as you want, and that's the end of the story. That's the myth that's out there. You address that nicely in the book, that it's a bit more difficult than that. You can actually bring in a simple Keynesian model of the economy that up to full employment increases in aggregate demand, expand production. At full employment, increases in aggregate demand, raise prices. You can have that little kink in the aggregate demand there. And that's how I do it. Obviously, in reality, it's a bit of a curve. It's not a perfect kink. On the other hand, that leads nicely into the issue of, and which again you bring up nicely, the issue of functional finance. And I would urge very strongly that anyone talking about the modern money theory include functional finance as part of the discussion, because it makes it very clear. What MMT does is, describes how money is created, how money works in the economy very, very nicely. But we don't want to leave that impression that modern money theorists are oblivious to inflation. That's a separate issue. So the way functional finance separates that is, it works really well. And the students seem to comprehend that quite nicely. One, we work with aggregate demand, and we work with money. How well does monetary policy work? How do these things work in order to get to full employment? And then the separate issue of this myth of financing specific expenditures and specific programs needs to be changed. And that's the point you obviously is central to the book. But add to that the general macroeconomics of the issue and keep them kind of separate. And students understand that even at principles level. After we've gone through the Keynesian model, they understand the macro quite well. Then we look at how do we pay for specific programs. Well, if you're below full employment, you can actually print. If you're getting close to it, then we need to take aggregate demand away somewhere in order to replace it with what we want to do or have government do. So that's again, I think something that those of us in MMT, and that gets me around a lot of the conflicts at UMass between Marxists and MMTers, and that is that issue of just saying you can print any amount of money. Well, technically you can, obviously, but we need to be careful to not give that impression that most people seem to have erroneously, but have, that MMTers just say print money and everything will work out. No, I would hope that post-Keynesians are incredibly good macroeconomists. That's what Keynes was all about, after all. So that's my main suggestion to people using MMT. It needs to be worked in. It can be worked in very nicely into a principles course. It's not that difficult to understand. I have not had major issues. I mean, the quizzes and the assignments coming back on this seem to indicate the students are grasping it fairly well. So that's not the problem. It is including it. It is putting it in a framework that fits it. And the historical approach that I've taken seems to work quite well for it. So that's what they are. And again, just one very final comment. What would be interesting, and that I've added because questions have come up about this, and that is, where are the issue of asset inflation versus goods and services prices inflation? We have seen a tremendous expansion of the money supply, and we can say, well, inflation hasn't been a problem, but that's for goods and services. We have seen tremendous asset inflation. We are in a real estate bubble. We are in a stock market bubble. Again, I really probably shouldn't use that term bubble, because we'll see how far this goes. But we're seeing, the stock market went up, what 11% last year? I mean, it's just crazy in a not necessarily terribly well-performing economy. Where does that fit in to MMT? How does that work? So, I've introduced stock buybacks, and I've introduced a lot of aspects of what's really going on. Poor returns elsewhere, so things are piling into wherever they can, any store of value that might be possible to try. Students all want to buy Bitcoins now, and God knows why, but so we're seeing a piling into assets, and we'll have to see. MMT, I think, needs to deal with that, and we haven't dealt with it all that well. And what are the consequences of this? What's it going to happen? Is this going to just feed into another financial crisis, back to normal in a way, another Minsky event? Or what are the consequences of this? So I would recommend that. And finally, the issue of power. And that's, again, I've been a little bit indoctrinated being in a Marxian department. We talk about power a lot, the ability to determine what goes on in the economy. We are in an extraordinary period of concentration of economic power in the world. It is really quite disconcerting when you analyze it to any great degree. How do we get MMT type policies accepted widely? What is power going to do with this? They're happy to use Keynesian policies when it looks like everything's falling apart, but will they continue to do so when things in any way gain some sense of normality, or the ability to, again, just promote the interests of those that have the economic power? And again, that's something that, much of macroeconomics, and Keynes himself was weak on the power issue. So I would suggest that perhaps MMTers want to give some consideration to that, and you might address that a bit more in the book. There's a lot of interesting things we can say about that. But those are minor points. On the whole, the book has worked extremely well, and I strongly recommend that this book be used in courses. It's a beautiful way to provide tons of examples, tons of cases to illustrate the macroeconomics that you're teaching, be it in principles, be it in intermediate macro. It works extremely well. The students like it. They're very happy. And anytime students like a book, my God, use it, because it's hard enough to get people to read. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henk. All right, so we're going to move on to Zdravka.
Okay, thank you. It's nice to be part of this panel. Thank you, Rojhat, for organizing or setting up the webinar. And thank you to Reynold for reaching out to me and inviting me to the panel. It's worth noting that all participants on the panel happen to be past presidents of the Association for Institutional Thought at one point or another, which is significant because this book is a real contribution also to institutionalism, in a sense that it makes institutional thought available to the broader public, just like a worldly philosopher does. And I want to talk about using the book in intermediate macroeconomics. In fall 2020, I used the Deficit Myth as a supplementary book in an online asynchronous intermediate macroeconomics course that I developed and designed for this asynchronous delivery during the pandemic. So I would tell you a little bit about how it fit the course, how it worked, and a little bit about general impressions about feedback from students. So I designed the intermediate macro course to be with an applied, to have an applied approach. And I used the book only as a supplementary text, and the main textbook was a regular textbook in applied intermediate macroeconomics. So the overall goal of the course was to focus on obtaining practical skills using data. And also the course was writing intensive course where we practice writing within the discipline. So I developed a number of varieties of assignments that focused on different writing within economics, including descriptive reports, storytelling with data, discussion of data trends, as well as reflection on news, and more informal writing, such as journaling on each chapter of the book. And that was the place of the book in my course. Students journaled on each chapter independently, and more importantly, I did not lecture from the book. And now this was as a part of the 20% engagement activity. And so the journaling accounted about 10% only of the grades of the students. But interestingly, I found that students were engaged with the book, even though it was a low stake grading. And so I purposefully designed that so that students have the space to think and reflect and engage with the book without me framing for them the narrative. Of course, we had a structure of the syllabus that included within each regular topic, a topic about a policy note or a data or a measurement discussion that dealt with issues. And of course, they had various homeworks and so forth. But I left the book to be an independent and informal reading. So, however, I think that this approach works so that we kind of entrust our students to form their own opinions, and it worked in different ways. First, students appreciated the flexibility, the freedom. And then also they, given the controversial topic, I think that it was even more effective that they found themselves convinced by certain chapters in the book. And sometimes when they were still challenged or challenging their way of thinking, they shared with me, some of them shared with me that they have begun actually opening their minds. So some words that students used in their reflections, so they have two opportunities to reflect. One was through the actual journal entries, and another was in their final portfolios. This course was based on a final portfolio rather than a final exam, where students were able to practice revising and editing of portfolio, as well as self-reflection about learning. And many students expressed very much that they, even though they say we disagreed with some parts or they found it challenging, they loved the book. They loved it as a reading. They thanked me, that I have assigned this extra book, and they appreciated that they were steering their own time in this course with their own reading and their own reflections without me kind of lecturing out of it. If you want to explore this approach, I strongly recommend this book. It's great for this type of exploratory learning for students. All of the students were intrigued. Nobody said this is a boring book, okay? So, and they found it informative, or at least some chapters, different students found different chapters more informative than others. From all the 33 students, I would say that only 3 students I found that didn't engage or didn't have time to read the book. I think this is a pretty good approach to assigning a text like that. So I want to share with you what are some of the features that students found, or topics that students found most engaging. First, the buckets, the visualization with the buckets. When Stephanie explains the national income accounting, or just the deficits, I cannot tell you how many students refer to this bucket visualization. And by the way, for those of you who do not know, I just will attempt to show you an example so that you know what buckets I'm talking about. This is like, I don't know if you can see, but they're simple buckets. And I believe that if they were triangles or rectangles, or let alone balance sheets or equations, people will skip them, or at least they will not be so engaging. But they were referring on and on about the buckets, even those are things that they should know, from principles of macro. I think they disconnected with them and kind of set out what they knew also. Second, the examples from the arena of policy making also resonated with students. They appreciated that the author was part of the policy making process, and I'm sure Reynold is going to talk more about that too. Third, students related to the writing style, imagery, and the examples. And they referred how, oh, this made me think, I never thought about it, and they quoted various examples. And then most of the major concepts that impacted students were the following: currency issuer versus currency user. Okay, they started thinking in this term. Second, the sovereign federal government cannot run out of money. This statement, which is not the same as we print a limited amount of money, but this idea, this difference between currency issuer and user, sunk in most students. Then the government is not like a household. If only everybody understand this one point, we are halfway through understanding the economy, I would say. And then government surpluses followed by depressions and recessions. Many students noted about that as a kind of an aha moment. And finally, some more limited amount of students noticed this austerity is a failure of imagination, which I love the most because it connected to the job guarantee discussion, which, by the way, is very nicely within this book. And of course, Pavlina Cherneva's new book goes in more detail in that. Then some students like these examples of Warren Mosler's kids doing chores and his business cards and this type of thing. I think they're so important, no matter how much lecture time we spend talking. And then you have these simple examples, which for some time have been in the folklore, I would say, in post-Keynesian or general heterodox modern money theory. And there is a book now that says it, and students right away get it. So then chapter 1 and 4, I would say, were most revealing aha moments for students. This have to do with the household is not, government is not like household, as well as the deficits that are not. This is the most controversial, and by that I mean where students kind of more resistant or expressed like, they were challenged. These were the chapters about the deficits that matter, all the policies, all the issues that you bring, about environment, about work, and so on. Some students complained, well, they were too political. The author was openly politically taking a stand. Yes, but other students like that, and they said, oh, I finally see how my concerns fit in the overall, and my worries about the dooming deficits are kind of disappearing, and I'm finding, and this, by the way, goes back to what was mentioned before about modern money, descriptive versus prescriptive, which, by the way, Stephanie, addresses in the book. I think this is also, students got this descriptive, prescriptive. Well, in my opinion, when you describe the truth, it's always a prescriptive thing. It leads to something, right? So but note, this is fall 2020. This book basically was read by our students in a time of supercharged politically supercharged climate. Okay, where there is a lot of fear mongering of impending communism and so forth. And so our students in every day have to learn, as they are part also of this macro and micro kind of local demagoguery. So, I mean, I valued how the students, even the most skeptical, and some of them said, we started being skeptical, and they got some out of the book. They got to open their minds and to think, and what more do you want as an educator? Now, I also find chapter 2 on inflation as one of my favorite chapters, and by the way, very useful to teach Nairo or the issues around Nairo. And it's very well written chapter. Also, anybody interested in social justice issues, if they read this chapter on the inflation, it's like reading the contribution of post-Keynesian thought to any social justice economics. So chapter 5 on trade also employs effectively the bucket visualization, now with the foreign sector very nicely, but also provides a very nice political insights about the political moment of how how this anxiety about the structural change in the economy was used for this kind of populism. It's very interesting, I think, political analysis too. Now, if there is one chapter title that is my favorite, or sub-chapter, rather, subtitle, this has to do with, I just want again to show, with the national debt. There is a subsection called "It's so big," and so "oh" is written like trillions. It's such a clever idea. This is my favorite thing of the whole book. So then related, I appreciated the usage of some timely Mark Twain quotes. My favorite is, "It's easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled." I mean, think about it. Indeed, chapter 3 is one of my, again, favorite. I mean, the whole book is favorite, but because it challenges the demagogue scaremongering of the American people that each individual owes thousands and thousands of dollars to pay the public debt. Some of my students got this by pointing out the debt clock and calling it, So anyway, the book, The Modern Money Approach and Institutionalists, point to the distinction between material resources and financial claims. As James Galbraith wrote recently, America's problems of inequality and precarity are not really issues of material scarcity. They reflect an unsustainable maldistribution of wealth and power. A point made by other institutionalists, like one of our panelists, Jim Peach, in a different book. What the modern money strain of institutionalism brings in is the liberating understanding point that material resources can be channeled through using the public institution of money as a permission to solve problems. I have called this getting out of the ceremonial encapsulation, to use an institutionalist term, the ceremonial encapsulation of artificial financial scarcity. Hopefully the book will help more beyond the painful self-encapsulation. The book and the modern money theory arguments, including the job guarantee, really deserve attention from all heterodox economists. As Randall Ray said, and we all know, it's not a lack of things to do that causes unemployment, it is a lack of paid work, and we use our imagination, as the book ends up with that, to find the problems and create the jobs and other solutions. At least institutionalists know that this tension between monetary investment and needs is the dichotomy described by Veblen. Understanding the myths described in the book and basic facts about deficits and debt, such as basically the chapter 4 title, "The red ink is our black ink," are needed in any transformative project. You cannot go around it and be revolutionary, right? Solving problems is what I mean by revolutionary, right? So overall, this opens up ways to relate to environmental issue, care, unemployment, and work. So I think this chapter towards the end was very appropriate and necessary and cohesive in the whole book. And this basically means opens up ways to relate to many economists concerned with those issues. Overall, I would suggest giving it a try to use this book as a supplementary text in intermediate economics, and also to let your students read without lecturing them about it, because the book is so well designed. Of course, you are going to do your own lectures, but don't lecture from the book. I mean, this is one experiment to do. Also, I suggest you recommend the book to your friends from other departments. Well, to the extent that we have other departments, in the way that public universities have been going, destroying units and so forth, soon faculty will not have to whom to recommend the book. But anyway, the good news is the book is great for non-economists, and I think and this is one of the great features of the book. With that, I will let the rest of the speakers go.
Thank you very much, Zdravka. Last but not least, we're going to hear from Reynold Nesiba. Floor is all yours, Reynold.
Great, thank you all. Just as Jim Peach was saying, you know, the ideas of economists like Milton Friedman and monetarism really did provide intellectual cover to Paul Volcker in 1979 for the great monetarist experiment. I think right now it's the ideas of MMT and Stephanie Kelton that are giving cover both to the Biden administration and before that, to some degree, the Trump administration, as well as Congress, to be able to engage in multi-trillion-dollar deficits. David Dayan over at the American Prospect had an email that went out earlier this week, and he said that one theme of the early Biden administration is that the dragon of deficit hawkery has been slayed. I'm not sure that that's true. At the same time, we've heard this week that the transportation, the infrastructure bill being put forward does have a pay for in it, worked out over a longer period of time. So I still think that Stephanie's argument is necessary in the world to continue to just address that deficit hawkery that seems to follow the Democratic Party around at the federal level. I would like to share my screen here, and I don't know if I can do that or not.
You should be able to do that, Reynold.
Should be able to do that and be able to do that and see if you can you all see that or not? I can't see it, I guess, yes, but yes, you all can. So great. Be good. So, and some debate. I can't remember if this is the 41st or 42nd AFIT meeting. I thought it was 42nd, but past that. So what I did is I've used Stephanie's book this past semester in my money and banking course. So this is a traditional mainstream money and banking course. I use a textbook by Cacchetti and Schoenholtz, their 6th edition, rely on their online learning system. And most of my lectures are out of that and out of the contents of that text. Contract to what Z said, I do lecture out of Stephanie Kelton's book as well, and I think what matters is what the objective is. I'm trying to get students to think about the intersection of how what the textbook is saying one thing. The textbook is saying when the government runs deficits, it causes the interest rate to go up and crowds out private investment. And Kelton's book is saying something completely different. And my students, when I first ask them this, they can get that conclusion. But when I push them a little bit to think through the reasons for each of those, it's a little more complicated, right? So they needed a little more help on this. So this is also, I guess there's two things that make this course distinctive. One is that it's a writing intensive course. I don't know how many people teach money and banking, but I have them do 5 short papers of 2 or 3 pages in length, and then they do have a significant term paper that they have to do as well. That's 10 to 12 pages in length. And so what I do for those short writing assignments, I'll give you a glimpse of them here, is that I'm trying to get them to think about some of these are summaries. So the first one, summarize Kelton in the first chapter in 2 double-spaced pages. Be sure to explain why governments engage in taxation. Why is federal government spending fundamentally different from a state government, private business, or household? Again, Z talked about that important distinction of one of these things don't belong together. I'm going to come back to the second one. What effect does deficit spending have on interest rates? Because I want to just talk through that one. I also asked them about what's the relationship between federal budget deficits and private sector surpluses, which in many ways gets subsumed into that second question. And then I have them think about the 3-sector accounting identity and its implications for understanding the trade deficit. From Kelton's perspective, what policy issue primarily drives the nation's desire to run a trade surplus? Is there some other way we could possibly address that issue of unemployment? Yes, there is. So it's a chapter on that job guarantee is that solution. And the last question is Social Security going to be around when you retire? And what does Kelton see as the primary threat to entitlement programs? But I think the best question that I asked him was the second one. So what effect does deficit spending have on interest rates? Use words and diagrams to compare how Cecchetti and Schoenholz's bond market diagram, their figure 6.2, explain the effects of government spending on interest rates with Kelton's discussion. And that they were able to do this, but just being able to put it in this framework, part of the problem was we do, like Jim Peach does, I want to talk about the loanable funds market. And it's so, it's a habit to talk about it from a classical perspective or Vixel or something perspective. I was surprised when I went to the index of the Schoenholz and Cecchetti book to find there is no loanable funds market. Right? We all talk about it as though it's something that everybody has in their head, and maybe we all have it in our heads, but it's not in the money and banking text that I'm using. And so the closest I could come back to was, and I stole this shamelessly from Cecchetti and Fernholz from their textbook, that from their perspective. If there's government spending, that's an increase in borrowing. It means the government is issuing more bonds. That pushes down the price of bonds, which means interest rates are having to go up. And if interest rates are going up, it's going to crowd out private investment. That's the story. That's if they don't use a bond market like this, or they use some other diagram like that is the typical classical, neoclassical perspective on that. And students were able to tell me that that Kelton had a different perspective, that she could see that an increase in government spending, running budget deficits, would lead to an increase in reserves. And that increase in reserves would actually push the interest rate to zero. But there was no simple way to be able to diagram that until I got a little bit further in the book. Been a while. This is been a long time, 4 or 5 years since I taught the money and banking. And I found that I wish that I would have used the end of the book, because at the end of the book, they talk a little bit about the market for reserves. And then that does take a little more explanation to be able to talk about what that would look like. See if I can, as I'm messing that up, of being able to see that an increase in government spending necessarily means that funds are flowing from the government sector to the private sector. The government deficit is the public sector surplus. As a result of that increased surplus, that means there's going to be an increase in bank deposits. There's going to be an increase in overall banking reserves. That increase in the supply of reserves is going to push the interest rate down below the Fed's target rate. And without some intervention of some kind, the rate's going to fall to zero. And of course, now for the last decade or so, we've had that interest on excess reserves that really serves as a floor on that. And so I was happy that students were able to reach this conclusion. And this is just text I copied and pasted from one of my students. And as a concluding paragraph, the student was able to use the bond market, tell that sort of story, and then be able to be able to say this that I put here in italics. Why do these models present exactly opposite findings? The core reason is that the Cecchetti's bond diagram, the government finances the deficit with borrowing. In the bond diagram, the government needs more borrowing from the market. Increases in government borrowing increase the market interest rate. In contrast, from the MMT perspective, the government does not need to borrow. It spends money into existence, which is one of the main things we want them to get out of reading that book. So further, the interest rate is not determined in a free market, is instead set as a result of monetary policy decisions. These fundamentally different perspectives determine whether interest rates are going to increase or decrease with higher deficits. With Cecchetti, a higher budget deficit means higher interest rates and less private investment. With Kelton, a higher budget deficit will lower interest rates, and if left unadjusted, will lead to more investment. These two theories explain what may happen to interest rates and investment when deficits increase, but they produce two deeply different results. what I'm teaching, and I would imagine everybody on this call agrees on this, is that pluralism is important. That teaching MMT isn't just about helping them understand how Kelton thinks the world works. I think it helps them understand how Cacchetti and Schoenholz understand the world to work, and allows them to see two different perspectives and to hold these contradictory ideas simultaneously, which is, I think, a sign of education, or might be a sign of madness, but I think it's education. And that by assigning a book like Kelton's, it actually deepens a student's understanding of the mainstream theory, as well as seeing the possibility of an alternative. And when we live in a world with multiple trillion-dollar deficits and interest rates that are almost zero, that empirical evidence sure is a strong argument that Kelton seems to have it right? That modern monetary theory has an explanation for what's happening in our world right now, and why these huge budget deficits are not causing inflation. So a few things I learned from this, and this might be a little at odds here with what Z said. So I think students actually needed far more help on this than I initially expected. Students could see the opposite conclusions. However, many could not carefully explain the logical steps of either the textbook, bond market diagram, or Kelton's argument. I had to spend some time in class on this, and I confess that I assigned this. I took their papers, I made some comments on it, and I gave it back to them and said, you know what, let's take this through another draft. And I talked about it some more, and their papers were much better that second time around. This also happened at a time when about half of my class was in COVID quarantine, and it was great to not have a new assignment and to send them off to redo this. I've been teaching in class in person. We're just using masks and social distancing to be able to do that at Augustana. Second, as I said, this assignment would have been better had I also assigned those few pages around from chapter 18 to be able to talk about the market for reserves, to help them be able to do that. Because as Jim Peach said, there is this need for some equations or some models to be able, they do have some persuasive power, particularly in a classroom. And if we're going to teach these ideas, being able to communicate it in a way that most of the profession already uses is important. So that translation process of how do you turn Kelton's ideas into something that's consistent with a traditional money and banking textbook or intermediate macro textbook or an undergraduate macro textbook like Hank is using, I do think is really important. So we have to continue that translation of these ideas into forms that students can understand. Lastly, just as an aside, for the first time ever, I had my students, because of the pandemic, I had them record their final presentations. And that was, I did that simply because I didn't want to have to give us together one more time. And we were ending the course at Thanksgiving. The Augustana sent everybody home. And so rather than relying on everybody's Zoom capability at home, I wanted them to record their presentations and then upload them. And then we played them during the class. They were the best set of presentations I ever had. So I thank the pandemic for that. I'm going to ask students to record presentations in the future and have them played. It also ensures that they keep to the time limit, which I'm trying to do here as well. And fourth, it is just useful to have an opportunity to reflect on one's teaching. I'm grateful for this panel for this opportunity to do this, and to have the honor to talk to the author about this as well. So I'm glad that AFIT continues to sponsor and allow these conversations, and I'm grateful to all of you for your thoughts. I've been taking good notes today, so I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reynold. So I think it's a good time. I know that we have two questions from those who are watching this webinar, but I'm going to let Stephanie first respond to the panelists' comments and questions, and then we can look at the chat board and see what questions that we have there, and then we'll take it from there. So Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so very much. It's so nice to see you all and you know, I wish we were together in person, obviously, but hopefully very soon we will resume having these kind of conferences the way we used to. And I can't wait to see you guys again. So thank you for giving the book a chance and introducing it to your students, and for the many incredibly generous things that you all just said about the work. I mean, you know, this was a hard book to write because I had a very different impulse in mind when I started writing. And it was an impulse that I had to continue to suppress throughout the entire book. And, you know, obviously I had an editor at the publishing house who, you know, he doesn't really have, I don't think, expertise in economics, but he was good at pushing me, and I think pushing me in the right direction. And you know, when I found out early on that I wasn't going to be allowed to use diagrams, I thought, how am I supposed to do this? You know, I'm writing, this is economics. And he was absolutely right. I am convinced that he was right, that he wanted this to be the kind of book that just anybody could walk into a bookstore, pick up, give it a quick, like, you know, open it up and not be intimidated and put it right back down. And so I thought, this is the challenge then, right? Because we've all been working, MMT economists collectively and individually now for a quarter of a century, and writing and publishing and trying to communicate at different times with different audiences, our academic peers, the public. You know, I launched this blog when I was at UMKC that Randy and Matt Forstatter and Pavlina and Scott Fulwire and you know, lots of people contributed over the years, and then communicating with the press and the public. And so you look for ways to be persuasive and to provide enough compelling, you know, evidence and sound economics, but without the accompanying, often intimidating numbers and graphs and all the rest of it. So it was interesting to hear, you know, Jim say, well, you got to use data and equations and graphs because that's how economists want to communicate. That's our language. Well, okay, I accept that, but this book was not aimed at my fellow academic economists. That just wasn't the audience. We do that and have done that for many years in lots and lots and lots of places. So, you know, I hear this and I do get, to be honest, frustrated because people will often say MMT doesn't have any graphs or equations. It's not, they don't do real economics. It's just like one long running narrative or something. So, you know, let me just put a couple of examples up if I can. I have too many tabs open, but hold on, you have way too many tabs open. I don't want Word. How do I just want you to see. Yeah, that's probably it. Well, let's go here and see what happens. All right. So are you seeing? Okay. So here's a piece from Scott Fulweiler. Now I pulled it up on the internet, but it's published as an academic article as well. And so of course we do macro modeling, right? That incorporates a godly-like, you know, sector balance framework, but we can put it all in the language of economists and have. And so you can find diagrams and arguments like these. You can pick up an actual textbook written by MMT economists. So, you know, to say if we want to get MMT into the textbooks, we're going to have to use models. Well, MMT is in the textbook. This is the leading, I think, MMT textbook. And people like Eric Temoyne, who was one of, you know, our students a long time ago at UMKC, who's now, you know, been a long time tenured professor, and he's probably got a 700 or 800 page money and banking textbook that is absolutely chock full of graphs and equations and diagrams and all that, you know, the usual sorts of things. I would say this is a paper that was one of the first really early papers. This one was written by Pavlina, but this is sort of price theory. If you want to think about how MMT approaches the question of what determines inflation and how should we think about determining the price level and so forth. This is Pavlina's work. Now, it's just full of equations and graphs and this sort of stuff. But wait, there's more, right? I mean, I did this in a chapter in a book, I don't know, a long time ago. I did not name it the Kelton curve. That was Scott Fullwiler. But another example of, a sort of model, something we can depict to represent the way that we think about the relationship between monetary policy, movements in the rate of interest, and the level of economic activity. And so I did here, a key MMT, I think, contribution is to point out that we may not be thinking correctly about the relationship between interest rates and the level of economic activity. We think the Fed raises interest rates to slow things down, cuts interest rates to stimulate activity, but there is a possibility, at least, that we have this backwards. And that's what I wrote about in this chapter. And I have a little model to, capture that line of thinking. So I just wanted to put up a few examples to let folks be, clear that MMT economists, academic scholars have always, and now for 25 years, produced research that includes the usual sort of approach in economics, graphs and equations and all this sort of stuff. What else do I want to say? I want to say something about Hank's comments, because, Hank, it's so funny. You're there at UMass and you say, I can't figure out where this hostility comes from. And I have to say, if you can't figure it out, none of us are going to ever figure it out, because, you're there, and I can tell you, I don't know where it comes from. If what you hear when you are at UMass are people, especially our peers, right, other economists, other academics, caricaturing MMT as, just print money, and that's really all they've got to offer. That's willful misrepresentation. That's not confusion. That's just a willful, I think, misrepresentation of the work. You won't find that in MMT. On the price theory stuff, I mean, I think we have tried to be much more sophisticated than even, you don't see any increase in prices until you hit the full employment wall. And then at capacity constraint, the thing goes vertical and you get, pure inflation or something. I think for us, that would be too simplistic. So people like Scott Fullwiler and I mentioned Pavlina have written a lot to try to get us to a more nuanced and sophisticated way of thinking about inflation. Of course, I have a whole chapter. Chapter 2 is called Think of Inflation. And so, we definitely want to think and think hard about inflation. Something about power also, Hank said that, if I often hear people say, well, MMT sort of ignores power and power relations. And I think this whole book is about power and power relations. The entire book, challenging the premise, the deficit myth, is taking on power. It's what Bill Black, my old colleague at UMKC, used to refer to as a career limiting gesture. These are the things that, you don't question certain shibboleths in the economics profession, right? That the central bank is the most appropriate institution for managing fluctuations in the business cycle and inflation, being just one example. Deficits driving up interest. There's certain things that you don't challenge. Even talking about money is considered a bridge too far many times in economics. So this book is about trying to defang and dethrone, I think, the power elite that have weaponized deficits and the national debt to hold back an agenda. You mentioned the people's economy, to prevent us from building a people's economy. So, in the book, in the chapter on trade, I talk about the legacy of colonialism and the IMF and the things that have been done to trap nations and their people on this, never-ending treadmill of extracting, expropriating from their from their countries for the sake of, paying creditors. And that's all about power, right? So I just want to kind of point that out. I love that Zdravka said that her students thought chapter 7 got a little bit too political, but Jim thought that the book was not political enough and too much, treating it as just a lens. But I think Z is right. I mean, I share the view that when you correct people's vision, when you give them the proper lenses through which to evaluate policy options, that you almost automatically end up pushing things in a progressive direction, right? So that was certainly my hope. And I say, in the book, one of the main points of MMT is to demonstrate that unemployment is always a policy choice, that we can do better than this current framework of relying on the Federal Reserve to figure out how many people to hold hostage in unemployment for the sake of tempering inflationary pressures. And the last thing I'll just quickly say, I know you want other people to have a shot. Reynold, you brought up this, the deficit myth, is it really dead? And no, it's not, and I agree. And you mentioned Biden and this most recent package in yesterday's speech. And yeah, I mean, there is still work to be done on this, right? Because he's talking about 2.25 trillion fully offset, right? Fully offset. And he even said that his proposal would raise more revenue than he is even proposing to spend. So he said, so we're so fiscally responsible that we're going to end up having a lower debt than we otherwise would. So, there's a lot of work to be done. I guess that's good for sales if the deficit myth lives on, but I sure hope it doesn't. And when Jim said that, I opened the book by saying the goal is to try to drive the poll numbers towards zero. When we ask people, how much are you worried about the national debt and deficits? I noticed the other day that the latest Gallup polls say that only 3% of the population cites the deficit as a major concern. That's pretty good. So I'd like to see us keep pushing towards zero. And I thank you all for reading the book and having so many of your students read it, and for commenting and giving me new things to think about, emphasizing more, because I recognize that there are things that ways that I can work harder to say more about social justice and power and inflation and so forth. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. There's one question that's been sitting there for a long time, so I'm not sure if you can see the Q&A. In case you can't, I'm just going to read it to you. Hazel Henderson is asking the question, we love your book. Do you agree with Karen, I think Petrose, that's the last name, engine of inequality, on the role of the Fed? You're on mute, Stephanie.
Hi, Hazel. I'm going to have to plead ignorance on the argument because I haven't read the book. So I don't know what is being argued. She's arguing about the role of the Fed. I think I'd have to know before I could say whether I agree.
Okay, so if Hazel weighs in, I'll certainly let you know. But there's another one in the chat that this could be something that you could see, but I'll read it out anyways. The world is now transitioning rapidly to a green economic paradigm powered by an inexhaustible access to cheap, clean energy, clean green, and electricity that could be stored in batteries, and as cheap green hydrogen. If energy is foundation of a thriving economy, how does MMT enable the global transition to sustainable living with the nature's capability to provide?
Yeah, so look, I feel a lot of the time like MMT is supposed to solve all of the world's problems or give us the clear pathway. And, my expertise is in macro and finance and, that sort of thing. So I do try to stay in my lane, but I will say that over my shoulder, I don't know whether you can see, I think you can, the Mariana Mazzucato book. the Kate Raworth book, right? The Donut Economics, and then my book in the middle. And the three of us are friends, and we see the synergies in one another's work. So where I don't have a complete set of answers to a question like this, what MMT can help us do is to demonstrate that the financing can always be managed, that the defining challenge of our time is dealing with climate change, right? To roll out a program that is ambitious enough, that meets the urgency of the challenge we face, that allows us to mobilize resources, solve problems. We can help with the how do we pay for it piece, and then point people to what we have to do is manage the real resources so that the spending can be safely rolled out over a period of, let's say, 10 years that allows us to meet the moment. So how do I take Kate's insights and Mariana's insights and put them with an MMT insight, and then together work toward the big answers to these questions? And that's the best that I can hope to offer, right?
And that could be your next book.
It's you're on to me.
So, Stephanie, I have a question on my own. I also used the book to teach non-majors at Columbia. We don't have economics department, so my students are artists primarily. And it actually, my students found it very accessible. So I just wanted to report back to you that how it would perform with non-majors. And also, I think there's a very nice narrative for students to follow, because some people are more inclined. I mean, they would certainly enjoy their experience if there's a narrative built into it. And I think there's a very nice narrative built into the book that makes it easy for non-majors to follow. So I got two questions. One of them is actually raised a couple of my students, and one is actually a question of my own. My question is a little philosophical. It's about the concept of a myth, right? So the book is trying to dispel a myth that you have to tax to be able to spend. So there are a lot of myths in life, right? And I'm not going to name any specific examples to be sensitive to people's sensitivities. So, so dispelling a myth for a policymaker is one thing, and dispelling a myth for the public is something else in my mind. Did you ever think about those implications? I'm not sure if it's clear enough. So, which gives let's say you have my vote as an economist. I can see it's a convincing and clear argument, and I may be in a position of power at some point, so they can guide my thinking. A public to know that the government doesn't need to tax to be able to spend has implications that go far beyond policymaking. Because it's just like there are certain myths that we don't touch, right? I mean, some religious beliefs are premised on certain myths, right? Some rituals are built on certain myths. So we don't touch those because I'm not sure, because there's something to be gained from touching those myths in the first place. So that's one question. I'm not sure if it's clear enough, because one of my students that started thinking about this, because one of my students brought up this question. Okay, if the government doesn't need to tax, doesn't need my money to spend, what happens to this connection between tax paying and citizenship, right? So you get you have a bit of a disconnect. How are you going to fill? I mean, then you have to fill that in with. I'm not saying it's the only sign of citizenship that we're paying taxes, but there's certainly a strong connection there, right? But once you figure out, as a member of the public, I'm not talking about the economics profession, that government doesn't need your money to be able to spend, then sort of it's a completely different. You're in a completely different realm. Does that make sense? So you have to fill that in with something else. I mean, those are two questions that I have. One is again inspired by a student of mine. The other one is more about like a philosophical question: if certain myths should stay, because of. I'm not saying this particular myth serves any useful purpose, by the way. But again, it's a different thing to just exposing a myth for what it is, as far as professional economists is concerned. But it's something else when you want public to believe. And you said that you wrote this book primarily for non-academic audience, right? So those are kind of my questions. I'm not sure.
I have wrestled with this question. I've been posed a version of this question many times. I was in a DM chat with my editor at the New York Times the other day, and he asked almost exactly what you just asked, which is, you know, April 15th is coming up. So here I sit now, you know, someone who is persuaded by the MMT argument that the federal government doesn't either need or rely on or use our money to pay the bills. Why am I about to write a big fat check to Uncle Sam thinking that I'm doing my part as a citizen, as a patriot of this country or whatever, in helping to pay for the military and to keep our infrastructure? How do I deal with the fact that my money is just going to go, you know, into a void? It's just deleting, right? You know, somebody said earlier, printing money or something. Well, paying taxes is unprinting money. The IRS is the graveyard for the dollar. So do you lose something in that? And maybe to some extent you do, but you also understand that it is through the removal of those dollars from our hands that our government is in a position to provision us with public goods, to give us better infrastructure, to give us healthcare, to do these things while maintaining the value of the currency. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good deal. You know, you depress what I have to some extent to provision the population and society with public goods, right? And so I think that works. And I could say so much more because I think about this. Yeah.
So the question is that you have to replace one myth with something else, right? You'll have to put something else in its place. So why I pay taxes, right? If it's not to be used to fund.
You could put an honest, I think that's the key for me. What you're replacing it with is honesty. And, you know, people on this call, I know some for sure know this because Randy Ray used to always use this quote from Paul Samuelson, where Samuelson is doing an interview and he's asked about this idea that the government, you know, has a budget constraint and that you have to live within your financial means and all this sort of stuff. And he readily admits that it's not true, that it's a myth, but he says it's one we have to keep in place because without it, where are we, right? It's one of these necessary lies that must perpetuate, because without it, you know, you don't have the constraining forces of, you know, restraint. And that's one of the things, you know, funny enough, a journalist named John Carney, way back when MMT was just getting into the sort of onto the public radar, John was working either for the Wall Street Journal or for CNBC Money. And he stumbled on the MMT stuff and he wrote a post, you know, I think for CNBC, and he said, oh my God, right? There's this group of economists out there explaining that the federal government's the issue of the currency. It can't run out. It's not financially constrained, doesn't work like a household. And he said, I've gone through it all. And he's their finance reporter. He said, it's all technically right. I can't find anything wrong with it. God help us if the government ever figures this out, right? Because he now writes for Breitbart and he's a conservative guy and, you know, small government, libertarian type. And so his big concern was, my goodness, what if the myth is exposed and lawmakers then begin to understand that they don't have to budget the way, you know, with pay-go and those sort of things in place and adhere to those myths of crowding out all the rest of it, you know. So yeah, I just think the truth is better than the myth.
Okay, fair enough.
Can I say one more quick thing? I know we've been here a long time, but I didn't want to leave this one unaddressed because I think Hank mentioned asset price inflation. Maybe Jim did. Somebody mentioned what does MMT have to say about, you know, asset price inflation or that sort of thing. I say, wow, so much, right? Because Minsky has been so integral to our work. And I'm talking about, you know, Eric Tomoin and Randy and Scott and myself, you know, but especially those that write a lot on the money and banking side. And I think of the fact that MMT has, from the very beginning, been trying to persuade us that relying on central banks as the primary lever, policy lever, monetary policy, to lay the foundation for a recovery after a downturn, to sustain adequate growth and so forth, was always the wrong way to go. And that it should have been fiscal policy, not monetary policy. And that by relying so heavily on central banks to engineer, right, financial conditions to support employment and growth and so forth, what we've done is become so susceptible to financial bubbles. Because, and this is where I'll agree with Larry Summers. Larry said some 2 or 3 years ago, he said, it's like we don't know how to grow our economies anymore. All we know how to do is blow bubbles. So we ride the commercial real estate bubble in the 1980s and woo, and then crash. And then we blow another bubble and we get a dot-com bubble and woo, and then crash. And then we do subprime and woo, and then crash. And it's, this insistence on relying on monetary policy, which works by driving people into debt, right? That's by design, that's how the policy works. And then with all the QE and so forth, designed to, try to generate wealth effects or otherwise increase asset price. So I just think MMT has a lot to say, and a number of MMT scholars have written quite a lot over the years about the risks of, a financialized system from a Minskian perspective, asset price inflation bubbles and all that sort of stuff. So it's all there.
Thank you. I don't think we have any questions from the public, but is there any other panelists would like to? I think Hank has something. Go ahead, Hank.
You here. Just very quickly on, the philosophical question you asked, Rojhat and Stephanie, that you tried to answer. Isn't the answer really the reality close to the functional finance argument? Wouldn't that frame it fairly realistically?
What do you mean?
Logically, that we have a macro economy to manage and we have to make decisions about what we want to do collectively versus individually in the economy. That's how I kind of teach it in class, this issue, the decisions that we have to make. And it's not specifically about money, but money is part of that when you talk about macroeconomic policy. Money can both enable activities to be done because, if money is lacking, it doesn't happen. But when you get to full employment, now we need to manage the macroeconomy, including money, so as to not push past that full employment, to keep us close to it. So by separating the macro policy from the decisions as to what to spend on collective versus individual, I think you sort of answer that myth. And that's not mythological at all. That's quite real and quite straightforward. And most students seem to be able to identify that with that fairly quickly. You're delinking the payments from the actual expenditures. That's the important contribution that modern money theory makes. But they can grasp those two separate concepts. We need to decide, do we do it collectively, public goods, or do we do it individually? And then we have to manage aggregate demand relative to the capacity of the economy. Anyway, that's
yeah, I mean, look, I appreciate that. I don't disagree with anything you said. I think maybe I interpreted the question differently. I tell the story in the book about the conversation Warren and I had with Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, where Cleaver said, I can't say that. I thought that was sort of the direction I took that to be the myth. But I can tell you that over the last couple of years anyway, so much has changed in terms of the kinds of conversations that I have with lawmakers, their willingness to do what you said, which is to separate in their own minds these questions about what can we afford to do and how should we wield the power of the purse, right? How should we approach the budgeting process? And now more and more getting them to understand that, MMT would have us replace the artificial, fake, imaginary budget constraint with a real resource constraint. and budget with that in mind, so that you're not removing choices. You're not making things unlimited. You're just saying the constraints are different. And, how should we think about that? Jim?
If I could just mention real quickly, the institutionalist literature has a long and substantial history of examining enabling myths. And you can start with Bill Duggar, but there are lots of others. And we could talk about other myths like that are just as central. The marginal productivity myth, that somehow your pay is related to your productivity. And if you destroy that, you've destroyed a good part of capitalism. And if I could mention one other thing for all of us to keep in mind, I'm a data freak, as I know some of the rest of you are too. One of the consequences of the pandemic has been another, just like in the great financial crisis, wrecking of the seasonal adjustment process. And so be really careful of looking at seasonally adjusted data over the next year. Reynold looks stunned. We had some very unusual activity in the first and second quarter last year, and that will feed into the seasonal adjustment process. You seasonally adjust based on historical data. And we had that problem. The most famous part of it was the first quarter GDP problem, was in part a seasonal adjustment problem due to the great financial crisis. We're going to see that again, and the numbers are going to be weird. So I'm just saying, watch out.
Thanks. Reynold, do you have something?
And I know our time is about to expire here, but one of the comments too that I would agree with is I wish there was more MMT in some of the popular press, whether it's the Atlantic, the American Prospect, and others. I'm grateful for Stephanie though for also writing editorials for the New York Times and the LA Times, and so thankful that she's doing that and hoping other journalists pick that up. But my question is to Stephanie is just what's next?
Well, I have two screens, two tabs in front of me. One is a piece for the New York Times, which should be up Saturday, I believe. What's next? I have so much in the works right now. A lot of it I haven't talked about yet and probably can't, but there's so much going on. I will also say The Nation did a huge feature piece on MMT with great cartoon imagery of Warren Mosler and Pavlina and myself, and I don't know, there was some rock star whatever thing. The New Yorker did a big feature piece on me. I've had features in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington. I mean, my goodness, I don't think the American Prospect, Dave Day, and a couple of days ago I did one with Anad Giardis in the Ink, just these big publications, wide readership, different, and then all the international stuff as well. So the book's been translated into more languages than I can keep track of at this point, I think. So I am working closely with lawmakers, and that's one of the big things that I'm currently doing. And I hope that a lot of that work will involve this next package. I hope it will grow. And I hope that the way, I think somebody mentioned Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez last night saying this package is much too small. It should be closer to 10 trillion to deal with the problems meaningfully that we face. So let's see what we can do to help guide that process and hopefully shape public opinion a little bit along the way and get lawmakers to remain engaged on the scale that's necessary to move a package like that through, thinking, how do I keep it inflation neutral instead of how do I keep it deficit neutral?
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to thank thank all the panelists, and Stephanie in particular, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been very illuminating and fun. So if there are no other questions, so I'd like to end the panel here. And again, yes.